Good morning, everyone. My name is John Lewis. I'm a research fellow with the program on extremism at the George Washington University. I'm very excited to have you all here today for what proves to be a very exciting and timely book talk. Here with Dr. Mauro Lubrano, here to discuss his book, Stop the Machines, The Rise of Anti-Technology Extremism. I think this is obviously a very timely and important topic, and I think that obviously when we look at in the 21st century extremist landscape, when we look at these online networks, the offline movements that mobilize in response to these grievances and narratives, what we see frequently is that this anti-technology heart that continues to exist at the center of it. I'm very excited to be joined here to discuss this topic. Dr. Lubrano, I'll let you first, I guess, kick it off by discussing how you came upon this topic and what it was like to actually do the initial research getting into this topic.
Thanks so much, John. First of all, thank you all for coming and thank you, John and Adriana and the rest of the team for organizing this, for inviting me, and yeah, for making this happen. So the book was published in the UK more or less 2 months ago in May, and in the US a couple of weeks ago. But it really, I really started working on this book back in 2019. Back then, I was a first-year PhD student at the University of St Andrews in Scotland, in the UK, working on a completely different topic, innovation in terrorist organizations. So actually, if anything, quite the opposite. I was working on how terrorist organizations use technology rather than destroy technology. But I happened to be in Berlin in May 2019, and I came across a flyer that was advertising a meeting at an anarchist social space. And the title of the meeting was something along the line of The Fall of AI, a call to fight AI as part of the technological dominion. And of course, piqued my interest. I was already working on political violence, so I found it quite interesting. And as any student of political violence, as virtually any student of political violence, I was familiar with the story of the Unabomber. And so I found this topic to be quite interesting. And I decided to attend the meeting, which wasn't particularly popular. I think there were more or less a dozen people. And the meeting was more or less a couple of hours long. The first hour, there was a lot of discussion of what AI is, what AI does, what it can do, what it could do, the potential consequences, and so on. But then they got to a point in the meeting where they started discussing, okay, what are we going to do about this? And there were a few suggestions, some of them classic suggestions of, let's retreat to the countryside, form a commune, renounce technologies, and so on. But there was one person in particular that was quite skeptical of all of these solutions, and this person was then invited to share their own perspective on this, their own solution, and they said, I don't really have a solution to this problem, but what I can tell you is that I cannot exclude a near future where I will punch someone in the face for wearing Google glasses. And of course, I don't know how serious the person was, but of course the comments, stuck with me, and I kept thinking about it. And so I started taking bits of time off my PhD to sort of try and read around this topic. But all I could find was, a few papers or books on the Unabomber and a few mentions of the topic here and there. So I sort of, take it upon myself to fill this gap, and I started working on a paper, which then I published during my PhD, and then I was approached by Polity, my publisher, to write a book on the topic. And I must say that initially I was expecting to find something a bit different to what I then ended up finding. I was expecting this phenomenon to be much more about fear concerning specific technologies, emerging technologies, nanotechnologies, artificial intelligence, and so on. But the more I was reading on the topic, the more I started sort of connecting some dots that I had already encountered before, but I sort of didn't make too much of a note of them. I remember I suddenly remembered like a case that occurred in Italy, where I'm from, back in 2012, when the CEO of a nuclear engineering group was kneecapped shortly after the Fukushima disaster. And when in court, the two insurrection anarchists who kneecapped him said that they did this to punish him for spreading nuclear technology around the world. And then I remembered an arson attack against the Italian Institute of Robotic. And so I started seeing that this was actually not isolated incidents, but sort of part of a more coherent campaign against technology. So it was, a bit challenging at the beginning, as I said, because not really a lot of works on this. I must say that this topic is, a lot of other people have now started like acknowledging and recognizing how importance of this topic. So there's been, since I've started working on the book, there's been a few important contributions, but it was sort of course, I was completing it while doing my PhD. So it's, that as if a PhD is not hard enough, then add another book project on top of that. But it sort of again started almost randomly, and then actually soon realized that the question that I started this project with, can anti-technology extremism become a major driver of political violence, is actually a very important one, and as you also remarked, a very timely one, because of all of the development that we see not only within political violence but also within society as a whole. So it soon became like much more than a book project, but like and sort of like there's so many different nuances that can be further explored, and I am planning to do.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many distinct threads that you can really pull, right? I mean, even in the book, when you kind of trace the history here of each of these, distinct movements, I think you can really see how easy it is for a lot of those anti-technology narratives and grievances to really just kind of be copied and pasted into these different movements and then be leveraged for that movement's own advantages.
Mhm.
I think it'd be great to kind of dive into the history here a bit, whether it's in each of these three spaces that you profile in the book or just kind of the origins of the anti-tech movement itself.
Yes, yes. So I think that to understand not just contemporary anti-technology extremism, but really any any sort of contemporary phenomenon, we need to understand the evolution of the phenomenon through processes that take decades, if not centuries, to unfold. And if we look at the modern history, we do see that anti-technology violence or anti-technology extremism has been a recurrent phenomenon, not necessarily a persistent one, but definitely a recurrent one. And in the book, I start my analysis from the first industrial revolution, so the early 19th century, and I start with what is perhaps the most misunderstood case of anti-technology violence, which is the Luddite movement. Now, we nowadays use Luddite as a sort of synonym for, deluded anti-technology, technophobe, and so on. But the Luddites were not really anti-technology as such, were more concerned about the impact that new technology was having on the production process, and how this was jeopardizing their position within the production process. They were skilled workers that all of a sudden were replaced by by unskilled workers, including, of course, children, as we know. So they were most interested in securing their position rather than destroying technology. But history hasn't been particularly kind to them, and they're now known as these deluded, irrational people that are against progress. So I start there to sort of see how this phenomenon evolved. And then I looked at the 20th century, and I arrived at Theodore Kaczynski, as I've already mentioned him, the Unabomber who waged this one-man war against technology for 16 years before being arrested in the mid-1990s. And a way to look at this evolution is that whereas groups of people like the Luddites were concerned about the material aspect of technology, like how technology was impacting their material security, we then see that this evolution actually leads groups of people will post technology to to be concerned about a more ontological aspect first. So what's technology like? Sort of how is technology redefining ourselves as humans and our relationship with one another and our relationship with nature? And then eventually, with Kaczynski and the contemporary anti-technology extremists, we see how technology takes on this existential dimension, how it is viewed as something that has the potential to erase nature, to erase life. Not necessarily meaning that all human beings will die, but that even humans themselves will be redefined on such a level that they wouldn't be humans anymore. And I identified three main ideological milieus that are now sort of at the forefront of this war against the machines: insurrectionary anarchist, eco-extremist, and eco-fascist. That doesn't mean that there are not anti-technology ideas in other milieus as well. If anything, for example, even among Black Pill Incel, there are sometimes mentions of technology and how technology has actually contributed to the contemporary situation. But in these three milieux right now, we see sort of the most sophisticated critique of technology and also the most sophisticated attempt to stop technology. But just because anti-technology extremism has emerged within these milieus so vehemently in the past 15 years, it doesn't mean that, again, they don't have a history behind that. And if anything, within each of this milieu, we can trace anti-technology ideas back to at least the 19th century. It is somewhat surprising, perhaps, that anarchists are included in this list of milieus, because in the 19th century, anarchists were actually, one of those groups that embraced new technologies. For example, embraced dynamite to carry out bombings. And in fact, they do have a love and hate relationship with technology. I'm not trying to say that all insurrectionary anarchists are anti-technology, but there is certainly a growing faction within this milieu that is increasingly against progress and against technology and against civilization as such. So throughout their history, throughout the last 150 years or more, they have sort of revisited their position when it comes to technology and developed ideas around technology that basically revolve around the notion that technology is a means of surveillance, a means of dominion, a means of control, but also that technology has evolved past human control and has become a sort of autonomous force that enslaves humanity. It's very curious to note that insurrection anarchist position on technology somewhat resembles that of Heidegger. Of course, anarchists would never love to hear that, because Heidegger, because of, it was a bit of a Nazi. So, don't tell anarchists that they have a similar idea to Heidegger. But it is certainly remarkable. But other than Heidegger, there were other, of course, there's other scholars, of course, that have actively influenced, because they're mentioned, actively influenced the anarchist position on technology. Lewis Mumford, for example, is a major one, and others. And when it comes to the other groups, again, the eco-extremists and eco-fascists, we can see that this, didn't come. It's not that anti-technology ideas don't come out of thin air. They didn't come out of the blue. There is a history there. In the eco-extremists, there are histories that this is a phenomenon that emerged in the early 2010s in Mexico, and then expanded to other parts of South America, and then also Europe, and to some extent North America. And they trace, they find their origins in, again, a bit of insurrection anarchism, the Unabomber, but they also are influenced by a longer history of anti-colonial history of South America. So there's a much longer history there. And then with the eco-fascists, we go back to the 19th century. Some of the very ideas that eco-fascism is based on emerged, from German Romanticism, the Völkisch movement, which then these ideas were absorbed into the Third Reich, and and then survived the fall of the Reich, and have now become, again, unfortunately, quite popular. And the idea there that basically modern technologies as this force of modernity that has disrupted the link between nation and land, and has led to the decay of, the white race, and they sort of actively want to go back to this romanticized and fantasy, past where, white people were at the top of human hierarchy and so on. So again, to understand how anti-technologies ideas emerged and evolved and manifest themselves nowadays in these milieus, we need to understand where they come from and how they have evolved throughout history. And again, also the way that they have also interacted with one another, the way that certain thinkers have, or doers, again, like Kaczynski, have influenced this process. And that, I would say that that's the only way we can actually understand what's going on and where this might go next.
Yeah, and I think that that last point really hits the nail on the head when we talk about the ideological flexibility of these movements. I think especially in the US context, when we talk about accelerationism and we talk about the mainstreaming and normalizing of a lot of those, there is no political solution concepts, whether you look at some of the eco-fascism coming out of those kind of like pine tree gang movements, whether it's the anarcho-primitivism stuff, like there is a very clear thread here where you see distinct movements and distinct groups picking up, engaging with these ideologies, these accelerationist concepts, and then just kind of twisting them and using them for their own benefit. Can you speak a bit to, yeah, I guess the accelerationist core that you see in both the anarchist space and then the eco-fascist space?
Yes. Oh, well, thanks for the question. So, accelerationism, of course, because of the predominance of the far right nowadays, is mostly usually discussed in the context of the far right, but we must not forget that accelerationism as a concept, as a strategy, as an idea, actually comes from the opposite, side of the spectrum. And although anarchists don't necessarily use the word accelerationism, they use the word accelerate a lot. But right now, perhaps, it's because it's not a cool word to use for anarchists at the moment, again, because of the predominance of accelerationism within the far right. They don't necessarily use the term, but what they are advocating is pretty much the same thing. They do believe that, the technology is a system that is beyond, it cannot be reformed and cannot be changed, therefore it must be dismantled. And the only way to dismantle is to try and accelerate is collapse. And how do you do that? You identify the weak links of the technological system and you target them. Now, it's quite interesting because in a couple of their documents, they do reference Kaczynski again, hit where it hurts, saying we need to attack the system where it's weakest. But really, their strategy is, as they have a dual, front strategy in a way. On the one hand, they attack infrastructures, and on the other, they attack research center laboratories and also people who represent or work for them. I mentioned at the beginning of the talk the CEO of the nuclear engineering group that was kneecapped. That was one of the most spectacular cases. But there have been others where they've sent parcel bombs to CEOs of Swiss Nuclear, for example. Sent parcel bomb to CEOs of defense or defense-related companies working on military technology, defense technology, and so on. We don't hear a lot about them because anarchists do tend to have a aversion for lethal violence. So they don't necessarily kill. They do occasionally, but it's not, it's the exception rather than the rule. So we don't necessarily hear about it, but it happens quite frequently actually. Anarchists are very active, but the level of violence is sort of low. Occasionally they will do something again that sort of stands out. But in terms of then attacks on infrastructures, uh, is uh, for, I'll give you an example, a recent example of how they try and identify the weak links. There's been recently an attempted attack, I believe it was in Germany, against companies working on microchips. And they were saying, well, what is one of the weak links of the contemporary, technological system is that everything needs to have these chips to work. And there's already like a shortage of them and all of these problems related to the production and, the geopolitics of these chips. And basically they attacked it saying, if we get rid of this, then we can actually, this damage that we will do will be much more than simply burning down a center. There's been discussions about burning down data centers, of course. So again, this idea that if you identify those parts of the system, the edifice of power, as they call them, then the rest of the structure will collapse. The attacks on the research in the laboratories follow a similar but also different logic, and they are also closer to, the good old-fashioned propaganda of the deed, whereby they try to sort of convince people to join their ranks and initiate attacks themselves. So despite being an accelerationist strategy, it is not necessarily a strategy predicated on mass murder or mass killing, but is instead aiming more at infrastructures and specific individuals within the system. So a more discriminate type of violence. Accelerationism also plays a considerable role in the eco-extremist. Now they're a weird beast because they're quite nihilist and they say they don't have any goal, but nonetheless they want to take they want to exact revenge on the technology and on how technology, because technology is destroying nature, and they identify themselves with nature. So they do attack technology, of course, and similarly they say we want to accelerate the collapse of the system, but at the same time they say there's no way we can do this ourselves because the system is too powerful. But without going too much into details on their not so coherent worldview, what they seek to do is similarly to identify certain neuralgic points, as they call them, that will accelerate the decay of the system. And again, we're talking about research centers, and again, we're talking about researchers, and again, we're talking about infrastructures. Now, with the eco-fascist milieu, things are a bit more interesting in some ways, because yes, they do adopt an accelerationist strategy, but yes, they also have different goals other than the collapse of the technological system. And if we look at until more recently, if we look at the target selection, there were more there were attacks that were like targeting for minorities and so on. Then obviously there's been a spike in attacks on critical infrastructures as well in North America, but also elsewhere, and many of them lead back to the far right and the eco-fascist. There's an interesting document that came out from the Telegram in the last few years, where this aspect is discussed, and they say one of the reasons why one of the reasons why our target selection hasn't reflected our eco-fascist goals more is because we're not ready to implement an eco-fascist society. Because if we did implement an eco-fascist society and got rid of every technology invented after the Industrial Revolution, foreign imperialist power will take advantage of it. And they mention in particular China and other countries, saying we're basically become very vulnerable. So they're sort of aware of a bit of international dimension of their struggle. So they say like, yeah, we could do that, but that will basically make us very vulnerable. But it's interesting to see that this idea of accelerationism is present in all of these three milieus, but they interpret it radically different. If we look at what they're doing and what they're saying, The motivations are quite different. The modus operandi, like the target selection might sometimes overlap, but not necessarily the way that they attack them, and not necessarily, again, the reason why they specifically select certain the very same target. So they have different narratives, but they all converge towards the same accelerationist goal.
Yeah. I just a couple more questions. I'll use the moderator's prerogative, and then I will open the floor to questions. So if anyone from the audience has any questions, please feel free to drop them in the Q&A. I think one piece that you mentioned a couple times in there that I'd love to drill down on a little bit. You mentioned propaganda of the deed. You mentioned the role of some of these figures, whether it's the ideologues or the actual actors themselves, who do have that almost I guess sainted, right? If you take the kind of like terrorgram far right ethos there. But can you talk a bit about the role of those key figures, especially Kaczynski,
Yeah.
as that figure that's kind of held up by so many different strands of these movements?
Yeah. Well, I think that if you want to be an anti-technology extremist nowadays, you have to deal with Kaczynski in a way or another. There's no way around that. He's the father of contemporary anti-technology extremists, and you just have to deal with him. And they all deal with him, in fact. Um, all of them discuss Kaczynski. All of them show signs that they might have been influenced in a way or another. All of them disagree on certain things. And it's very interesting to see also how they pick and choose, Kaczynski's argument. So, for example, insurrection anarchists completely buy his definition of technology. So the difference between tools and technology, tools being small-scale technology that basically operates as an extension of the individual body, and technology as an extension of the system. So basically, if I fashion an axe to cut cut down a tree, then that's a tool because it's an extension of my body. I don't rely on I don't rely on the system to make it work. I don't rely on the electric grid. I don't rely on someone else's expertise who is going to like fashion the axe for me and so on. And then technology, I believe that the Unabomber makes the example of a refrigerator, actually works as an extension of the system, whereby you cannot operate it by yourself. You probably cannot fashion it by yourself. You cannot build it by yourself, and you do still rely on electricity and so on. So it's an extension of the system, and it extends the boundaries of the system at the expense of nature. So the anarchists sort of buy that argument entirely, and they do say we need a society that's based on tools, rather on small-scale technology rather than organization-dependent technology. But then they sort of completely ignore the fact that Kaczynski in his manifesto calls for revolutionary vanguards. He doesn't call them like that. He doesn't mention Lenin. He doesn't call them revolutionary vanguard, but that's essentially what he's talking about. A group of committed professional revolutionaries who know technology very well and know how and where and when to attack it. Anarchists ignore that because being anarchists, they're against anything resembling, hierarchy. So and delegation. They prefer to take matters into their own hands through direct action rather than giving someone, authority to act on their behalf. So they sort of ignore that. But again, they have to deal with him. And as I said earlier, they do see sometimes there are a few anarchist documents where they discuss how their struggle against technology is the continuation of a war that Kaczynski started in 1978. So sort of they see themselves as part of that same struggle. They also, again, will find reasons to be against him. Let me say that the anarchist movement is vast, and insurrection anarchists are a small part of it. There's other anarchists that are actually quite against Kaczynski. They call him a fascist. They call him, all sorts of things. But among insurrection anarchists, again, he's been very influential. Then you go to the eco-extremists who have this weird love and hate relationship with him. And initially, they admit to having been very much influenced by him, to then have sort of distanced themselves from him and actually sort of critiquing his work. Now, Kaczynski has written a piece on them where he said that the eco-extremist understanding of revolution is at the kindergarten level. So, Kaczynski, quite harsh words. And so there is again this love and hate relationship where they, to some extent, acknowledge that they have been influenced by him, but then to some extent say, we're not him, we'll never be him. We don't aim for a revolution. Again, they're nihilist. They don't plan for the future. And Kaczynski was a bit of like delusional when he believed that actually the system could be destroyed. And any of the eco-fascists who Kaczynski, in general, among the far right, has become this sort of, one of the Holy Trinity in terms of the saints. He appeals so much to that community, even though he never made any argument that is sort of like resonates with their argument. Never made arguments based on race or whatever, but it resonates because of various things, because his lifestyle, because his sort of rebellious spirit, and so on, and has become a recurrent, figure in their propaganda, in their aesthetic, and so on. Now, what is interesting about this is that I mentioned already how the Unabomber was not so fond of the eco-extremists, but to be fair, he was not fond of any of these people. He wrote papers, attacking all of these milieus. He called eco-fascist an abhorrent like version of leftism or something like that, and I'm paraphrasing. So he had harsh words for all of these movements, of course, before he passed away a couple of years ago. Of course, he's not the only influential figure within these movements. There's other people that have contributed to sort of shaping the modus operandi and the ideology of this movement. Mostly operating, ironically, online. Of course, the anti-technology extremists do use technology quite a lot. And there's been a few individuals, for example, within the anarchist milieu that have become particularly influential. One of them, I have already indirectly mentioned him, is the person who kneecapped the CEO of the nuclear engineering group in 2012. He's an anarcho-nihilist, anti-technology, anti-civilizational, like he's not quite a gentleman, and his writings are quite atypical for anarchists. Are quite advocating for mass murder, advocating for violence, advocating for lethal violence, and so on. And then within the other milieus, again, there's different people. Some of them operate, in the public sphere. Some of them in a more clandestine one. Of course, these people are, when operating in clandestinity, they become influential within their particular milieu on different platforms, even when their identity is not revealed. And overall, they contribute to shaping, as I said, the ideas within these milieus, but also they advocate for specific modus operandi. And I'm thinking, for example, you mentioned earlier the pine tree, and I'm thinking, for example, Mike Ma's harassment architecture, but also other documents that have emerged from Terrorism in the last few years, where there's sometimes with pinch of irony, they say, "Oh, I'm not advocating for burning, for burning down the electric grid. I'm not advocating for attacking critical infrastructure and so on." But in some cases, of course, they provide very detailed instructions on how to do that. And the anarchists and the extremists do the same. I mean, if you spend any time on anarchist blogs, you will find manuals on how to take down 5G towers. You will find again manuals on how to take down different sorts of specific technologies and so on.
Yeah, and I think that brings us to another question that came in that's really interesting. I think when you look at the development of recent extremist ecosystems, they are inherently cross-ideological. I'm thinking especially of like the Boogaloo movement in the US, right? Where you had everyone from neo-Nazis to anarchists to jihadists, taking off their swastika and putting on the Boogaloo patch. Given that there is this kind of inherent cross-ideological element of the anti-technology, again, the strand here that we keep pulling on, How do you see potentially any of these distinct movements evolving, cross-pollinating, maybe if not explicitly collaborating in a formal sense, then perhaps sharing TTP, sharing propaganda across some of these actual groups that you're profiling here?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So, of course, when we look at anti-technology extremism in the contemporary landscape of political violence, we cannot forget the fact that, as we've been mentioning, there's this sort of, uh, cross-ideological movements. There's been a proliferation of labels to describe this hybridization of threads and these groups that have composed of different ideological worldviews, sometimes not so coherent, sometimes not so, sometimes not so coherent. And anti-technology extremism is quite flexible, so it can allow for a different combination in a way. So we see how it is used in the name of working class, in the anarchists, but also to defend nature and also to defend in a white supremacy context. So in the past few years, there have been occasions where these movements have aligned. In particular, for example, during COVID, there's been, if you look at some of the anti-vax, anti-COVID and anti-COVID measures and anti-vax protests, you do find some of these people basically on the same side of the fence, and even their justifications for being there are not necessarily that different. So there could be sort of a mobilization around specific issues. There are, of course, fundamental differences between these groups that they won't be able to reconcile. I honestly don't see a future where anarchists and eco-fascists happily go hand in hand, trying to do the revolution. But despite the fact that they have this fundamental differences, they sort of will display a certain characteristics when it comes to anti-technology, their anti-technology worldview. And this again, we go back to the idea of flexibility. There is flexible, but there is what I call, paraphrasing Roger Litwell, an anti-technology minimum. This is an idea of technology as a mega machine, as an all-encompassing essence that is made up of the physical manifestation of technology, the ideological manifestation of technology, that is the idea of progress, and the human component, humans being the cog in the machine. There is an idea that also, second point, that what they're trying to preserve is humanity and nature. So that they're trying to preserve everything that makes us human and nature as a sort of counterpoint to technology. There is an idea that technology is sort of leading us to a sort of dystopian society, thereby providing a sense of urgency, a sort of an apocalyptic thinking. And there is the accelerationist element that we have discussed. So when it comes to these issues, we can see overlaps in the way that they discuss these issues, despite the fundamental differences. Now, in terms of near or long-term future, again, I don't foresee these movements becoming a one unified anti-technology, coherent anti-technology movement, but there could be instances where, again, they mobilize around specific issues. There could be additional anti-technology actors emerging because of the flexibility of the ideology. I don't exclude a more religious approach to anti-technology. For example, we have the pro-working class, we have the white supremacy, we have nature. Why not, a more religious aspect of it? If we frame anti-technology within the context of the Anthropocene, then there have been also reactions to the Anthropocene from religious groups and religious interpretations and reactions to the Anthropocene. So that could absolutely happen. There have been also attempts to form a more monolithic anti-technology movement. And we've recently, in the last few years, few documents that emerged from obscure parts of the internet from a entity called Luddite Resistance, which, as far as I'm aware, has never carried out any attacks, but it's published a few interesting documents where they discuss an anti-technology strategy that is sort of like a Maoist interpretation of anti-technology, whereby they say we need to we need to retreat to the parts of the country where technology is less strong and sort of build up strength, build up momentum, and then carry out an assault on the center of technologies. Now, I don't exclude that there will be other, actually, I'm quite sure that there will be other attempts to do that. But again, in terms of how these groups operate, there could be overlaps, but they would retain the fundamental differences that characterize them. Oh, individually, in certain members of these milieus could be more fond of the other milieus. For example, the same guy that I've been mentioning a few times, Alfredo Cospito, he did say that he was quite fond of the eco-extremist milieu, whereas other insurrection anarchists have been critical of the eco-extremist milieu. Eco-extremists and eco-fascists themselves have in some way interacted with eco-extremists saying, well, we're not fascists, but we do think that there's a lot to learn from them. So again, there is like mutual learning and positive and negative learning, as in, sort of admiring, but also learning not to do certain things. So there are definitely interactions, but that doesn't mean that it would become a sort of more coherent movement.
Yeah, yeah, no, of course, and I think when we look at how the recent manifestations of it have evolved, I do think it certainly fits more into that decentralized, disorganized, just kind of one cell popping up here that has some elements of it. For the interest of time, I'll combine one audience question from another one from my own list. Can you talk a bit about the challenges you had while researching these movements that are, I'm sure, inherently not only anti-technology, but I'm sure a little hesitant about being discovered too much by researchers. And then with that and building off your last point you made there, how much do you see in terms of individuals just bouncing from movement to movement while maintaining that anti-technology thread? So how much do you see them being flexible within this ecosystem as long as there is that central strand of anti-tech going from, again, not from anarchist to far right, but perhaps bouncing within that ecosystem a bit?
So in terms of challenging, can you kind of challenges? Can you repeat the question very
Yeah,
quickly?
the challenges of researching these anti-tech movements that may or may not be using technology that much, or may or may
Yeah,
not be just open.
yeah. Well, as I mentioned minutes ago, there's this ironic fact that they do use technology quite a bit. And if you search again dark corners of the internet, you will find all sorts of ideological and propaganda material from these groups. You will find manuals on how to take down technology and so on. These extremists are completely aware of this irony, and they also provide justifications for it. It's pretty much they all say, well, we have to fight fire with fire. There's no other way around that. They do provide a bit of a more nuanced discussion around it, but essentially that's what they're talking about. In terms of talking to them, this has been much harder, and I have many occasions very much failed. I've been to a few anarchist spaces where I was greeted very warmly, but then the moment that I said that I was interested in doing research on these topics, they kindly asked me to leave because I am part of the system, Like it doesn't matter if my intentions are good, I am going to reproduce and replicate dynamic power dynamics that will inevitably lead to the oppression and domination of certain people. So speaking to them has been a bit more of a challenge. But again, they are luckily very fond of technologies. They use them quite a bit, which means it may not be instantly that you find their material, but you do. One challenge, particular challenge, emerged a few years ago when all of a sudden the main website that eco-extremists used to have was taken down by the police. In particular, there was an international police operation between Argentina, Chile, and Italy, and this main website was taken down, and that was quite frustrating because that was a main source of documents from it. In terms of these individuals like moving from milieu to milieu, there have been a few occasions, for example, where individuals that used to identify as intellectual anarchists have moved to the eco-extremist camp, and they have, changed their ideas a bit. They've changed their narratives a bit. They have renounced certain ideas. For example, this idea of revolution as the ultimate goal that you need to aspire, that you need to aim for. But again, those central ideas upon which anti-technology extremism is built, the mega machine, effort to preserve humanity and nature, apocalyptic thinking, and accelerationism are still there. Like they're seasoned in different ways, but they're still very much there. And in terms of this sort of alleged convergence between eco-fascism and eco-extremism, I think it's been more an issue of just adopting some successful aesthetic and narratives rather than actually buying certain arguments. It is also interesting to see, I've mentioned that some of these individuals identify as nihilists as well. It's been actually quite interesting to see how, nihilism then has emerged within other milieus, but has nothing to do with technology. So it's not necessarily, I think, where the two are not necessarily linked. There could be other reasons behind that. Yeah, I think that.
Yeah, no, I think that really hits the nail on the head there again. I guess that brings us to a bit of a forward-looking question. Again, building off the idea of nihilism there at the end. As you said, we have obviously been seeing the growth of not just that nihilistic violent extremist milieu, but yes, so many of these kind of whether it's the salad bar stuff, whether it's just this ideologically incoherent mess of personal extremism that is driven by some combination of grievance, bias, what have you. Um, where do you see this anti-technology movement going, right? Where do you see the movements that it has inhabited going? Where do you see them moving towards? What do you see as the I guess the near term future
Mm.
of this core grievance?
Yeah. So, of course, I mean, the question that I started the project with is, can this become a major driver of political violence? And the short answer is yes. The bit of a long answer is it already started, and it's already started. And the long-term answer is, I think that this will become a more predominant, like a more predominant driver. Because of its flexibility, it can lend itself to different causes. And because of we live in a society where there's a technological breakthrough every other day, basically, and concerns about AI and concerns about technologies are sort of growing. Because of this, I believe that there's a sort of like fertile ground for it. Some of the concerns that anti-technology extremists express are, of course, taken to an extreme, but the origin of those concerns are not necessarily invalid, are not necessarily crazy or you name it. I think that and we have seen it with different surveys and polls and whatever, that there is a growing concern about the role of technology in terms of surveillance, in terms of privacy, in terms of militarization of certain technologies, and so on. So the concern about this technology is real. And I think if they're not addressed properly, then it will sort of feed these ideas that technology is beyond redemption and needs to be destroyed. And then, of course, very few people, as is always the case, will cross the threshold of violence and decide to do something about it. But unfortunately, you don't need a lot of people to do a lot of damage. So we need to be aware of that. And again, I think that what the future holds for this movement and for this anti-technology extremism is that we will begin to see these narratives much more predominant in first in their words, but then also in their deeds. And again, we don't really need to. We just need to look for these signs of violence because they're everywhere. Like last month, a couple of months ago, when the festival in Cannes started, I don't know if anyone remembers, but there was a power outage, and the start of the of the festival had to be postponed by a few hours. And there was an insurrection anarchist group that did that. They attacked they attacked a nearby center, and like there was a power outage. There's allegations that at the Olympic Games, at the start of the Olympic Games, again, there was an anarchist group that sabotaged the high-speed trains. Um, these developments, if left, unattended, could become much more concerning. And again, we also need to work on preventing this to be becoming a much bigger dynamic in society, where these people are increasingly disaffected with technology, and they do resolve that the only way to deal with it is to renounce technology and reject technology. So I do believe that it's going to grow, and again, it's going to be decline in different ways depending on, or depending on combinations of other beliefs that stem from the dynamics that we've been discussing: cellular ideologies, composite violent extremism. Again, there's many labels that try and capture these ideas. So I do see this becoming like a more recurrent and, if not persistent, ingredient making up this salad of extremism.
Yeah, I think this certainly adds an interesting ingredient to the salad. I guess the last like big picture question that I think is interesting to address with the 8 minutes or so that we have left is the solution. You kind of touched on it a little bit there at the end, but how we should be understanding, conceptualizing this grievance, how policymakers, practitioners, law enforcement should be responding to this, right? I think, again, especially in the U.S. domestic terrorism context, we have seen the growth of that, whether it's agave, right, anti-gov, anti-authority, whether it's the broader anti-system, whether it's some of the assassination of the healthcare CEO, some of this anti-system broadly, emerging. How should we understand this threat? How should we respond to this threat? And again, going off of a very good point you raised in the book and in this conversation, how do we do it appropriately, right? How do we tamp down on the most extreme violent edges of this while also recognizing that, again, much like so many of the other forms of extremism that we see, there is a kernel of legitimacy. There is a shred of some legitimate mainstream acceptable concern here, right? So how do we balance? Again, very, very easy question to kind of close on, but how should we be thinking about this?
Yeah. So I think there's three main ideas there. The first one is not to uh, overreact, of course. We've been saying that there's some of these concerns are legitimate, some of these concerns are valid, and dismissing them or treating them as dangerous ideas could be dangerous in and of itself. There's a proliferation of legal and non-violent association organization movements that are trying to promote a rollback of civilization, deindustrialization. We shouldn't be, going after these groups, these movements, these associations, and so on. But also ideas that are not necessarily ideas that are not necessarily like pro-technology, ideas that are more on the anti-technology side, as long as they are, again, non-violent and so on, are not to be demonized. And we also have to be realists. These people will most likely, I hope I'm right here, but most likely they will not be able to destroy the techno-industrial society. So we shouldn't treat them as the next existential threat. So, good intelligence, good law enforcement work. In most cases, we know who these people are. Like at least in Europe, for example, with anarchists, despite their low level of violence, we persistent, continuous low level of violence, we know like quite, like that it can be kept under control. Of course, we need to accept the fact that some level of violence will always be there because that's the nature of living in a democratic society. Then we need regulation. I want to go back briefly to the Luddites. In certain other countries where Luddites-like movement emerged in the 19th century, violence was averted because governments introduced regulations that protected them. Now, it's not going to be, a silver bullet. It's not going to solve that issue, by itself, but it will contribute to at least in improving this sense of alienation from technology and this sense of frustration with technologies. But keeps looking at how AI has been used to monitor people on the workplace, looking at how AI is used to suppress and oppress demonstration, people at demonstrations and so on. We're perhaps not off to a good start, but we can still recover from that. And then finally, and this is easier said than done, there needs to be a paradigm shift in the way that we live our relationship with technology, rather than focusing on what technologies allow us to do, what activities they allow us to perform. We should be looking at how these activities, what these activities mean for our relationship with one another and our relationship with nature itself. There's an increasing alienation from one another and from nature, and technology is often looked as the culprit. So we need to sort of, of course, we cannot get rid of technology, but we can revisit the way that we interact with it to promote activities that foster a more meaningful relationship with one another and with nature. Now, go back to the idea of salad-bar ideology. You can improve things when it comes to anti-technology extremism, but you're still left with individuals that are disgruntled and have extremist views when it comes to other things. Some eco-fascists, Patrick Crucis, for example, did have anti-technology ideas. Take the anti-technology ideas away, and you still have a person who's essentially an eco-fascist and who embraces white supremacist ideas and so on. So it's not gonna, addressing these issues, not gonna like suddenly turn these people into into good citizens, but at least there's something that we can do to make sure that this technology, this fear of technology, these anti-technology ideas won't become too predominant, because we're going to see more and more and more and more and more of these technological breakthroughs, we are on the cusp of like technological revolutions that will redefine societies according to many experts, and the next few decades will, change society and the world as we know it, perhaps even ourselves as we know ourselves. So if we manage to work on these three aspects, then maybe at least when it comes to anti-technology violence, there's something good that we can do to prevent it from becoming a widespread driver of political violence.
Yeah. The very last, very quick question that just came in that I think is worth addressing comes from our colleague Yannick here, who asked whether we should be concerned that the language that has been used to analyze this anti-technology extremism could be co-opted by tech companies to delegitimize what, again, we've discussed are these legitimate concerns about whether it's environmental degradation, digital privacy, labor rights, wealth concentration. So, really boils down to can we trust tech companies to be a good partner in the fight against anti-technology extremism? Obviously, there's been a bit of a checkered past when it comes to their ability to moderate content for foreign or domestic. But yeah, do the tech companies have a role to play in this as ideally good faith actors?
Well, I think absolutely they do. I mean, in the eyes of the anti-tech extremists, they are beyond redemption, and we've seen campaigns against specific individuals. There's a few that are still ongoing, but the issue here is, and again, I think there's a lot that history can teach us here. Clearly, the factory owners were not happy when the Luddites were breaking machines because they were not happy, but they were also very happy to implement those machines because they would save them money, increase profit, and who cares if you exploit a few people in the process? And I think that there's a risk of history repeating itself here, where you have these tech companies and the people at the top of them that are not necessarily willing to sort of question these technologies in the first place. But it is also essential that we bring them into this debate and to this discussion. They have to be partners in this, absolutely, and they perhaps are, one of the main actors that should try not to demonize these people that express concerns about technology, and they shouldn't call for the prosecution and penalization of these activities of this movement.
Yeah,
Of course, the non-violent legal movement,
of
not
course. Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, no, a very, very, very fine line there, as always. Well, look, thank you everyone for attending today's book talk. I think it was a fascinating discussion on a very timely and important topic. Please join me in thanking Dr. Lubrano for taking the time. I would encourage all of you to go purchase the book, Stop the Machines, available through Polity and wherever else you purchase your books. Thank you all again for joining us, and yeah, have a great rest of your day. And we look forward to having you again at future program events. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Thanks,
Thank you.
John.